A chain that was open last month is already gone this month. No grand announcement, no farewell sale that made the evening news. Just a sign on the door one morning that was not there the night before, and a parking lot that has been quiet ever since. Across the country, something is happening right now to some of the most familiar names in American dining and retail. Names that were on every highway exit and every shopping center for decades. Names that most people assumed would simply always be there. Today, we are looking at 12 of the biggest chains in America that are disappearing in the months ahead. Francesca's operated more than 450 boutique clothing stores across the United States and built a loyal following among women who came for the jewelry, the gifts, and the kind of carefully curated merchandise that felt personal rather than mass-produced. The stores had a specific atmosphere that larger retailers never quite managed to replicate. Small enough to feel intimate, stocked carefully enough to feel like someone had actually thought about what was on the shelves. For the customers who loved Francesca's, the experience of walking in was genuinely different from walking into a mall chain that stocked the same items in every city in the country. In January 2026, the company filed for bankruptcy again, and this time there was no restructuring attached to it, no new ownership waiting to take over, no scaled-down version of the concept trying to survive with fewer locations. Employees received termination notices without warning. Liquidation sales began immediately across all remaining locations. Every single Francesca's store in the country is permanently closing. A brand that had survived its first bankruptcy in 2021 and spent 5 years trying to rebuild did not survive its second. The boutique clothing sector that Francesca's helped define is not disappearing with it, but the specific experience that hundreds of thousands of loyal customers built their shopping habits around is gone in a way that no other brand will fully replace. Red Lobster was for decades the place that made seafood feel accessible to every American family regardless of where they lived or what their budget looked like. The Cheddar Bay biscuits that arrived at the table before anyone had even opened the menu. The endless shrimp promotion that became one of the most talked about deals in casual dining history. The aquarium near the entrance that children pressed their faces against while waiting for a table on a Friday night. Red Lobster at its peak operated more than 700 locations across the United States and represented something genuinely democratic about American dining. You did not need to live near a coast to eat lobster. You just needed a Red Lobster nearby. But the financial decisions that accumulated over the final years of the chain's independent existence proved impossible to recover from. The endless shrimp promotion alone cost the company approximately $20 million in a single quarter. Thai Union, the supplier that acquired Red Lobster in 2020, used the chain as a customer for its own shrimp products in ways that prioritized the supplier relationship over the restaurant's financial health. Bankruptcy followed in May 2024. More than 100 locations closed immediately. Additional closures continued through 2025 and into 2026. The Times Square location that had served millions of tourists closed in June 2026. The oldest operating Red Lobster in the country closed in May 2026 after 56 years. The chain that once made seafood dinner feel like something any family could do on a Tuesday night is disappearing one location at a time. Hooters was never just a restaurant in the way that most restaurants are just restaurants. It was a brand identity, a specific atmosphere that was either exactly what you were looking for or completely not your thing, with very little middle ground between those two positions. For the customers who loved it, Hooters was the wings, the cold beer, the sports on every screen, and the particular energy of a dining room that never took itself too seriously. The chain grew to more than 400 locations across the United States and became one of the most recognized casual dining brands in the country. But the financial pressures that had been building for years finally became impossible to manage. Hooters of America filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in March 2025, carrying approximately $376 million in debt accumulated under previous ownership. Dozens of locations closed immediately across 14 states, with employees in many cases finding out their restaurant was permanently closed the same day customers did. The closures continued through 2025 and into 2026. By mid-2026, entire states had lost every single Hooters location. New York became completely Hooterless. Massachusetts followed. The brand that had been a fixture in American casual dining for decades was shrinking faster than any restructuring plan could address. More than 40 additional locations are expected to close through the remainder of 2026. What remains of Hooters is a fraction of what existed 2 years ago, and the fraction keeps getting smaller. TGI Fridays invented something when it opened its first location in New York City in 1965. The idea that a bar and a restaurant could exist in the same space, and that the experience of going out for a meal could feel genuinely celebratory rather than purely functional, was not obvious before TGI Fridays made it obvious. The chain grew into one of the most recognized casual dining brands in America, with hundreds of locations across the country, and a brand identity built around the particular joy of making it to Friday. For decades, that identity resonated with millions of American diners who made TGI Fridays a regular part of how they marked the end of a working week. But the chain that once defined casual dining celebration has been contracting for years in ways that its brand identity could not stop. TGI Fridays filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in late 2024 and began a liquidation process that has steadily reduced its American footprint from hundreds of locations to just 79 restaurants still operating as of late 2025. The liquidation plan was approved by the bankruptcy court, and the company confirmed it had no plans to open any new U.S. locations in 2026. A chain that once had a location in virtually every major American market is now present in only a handful of states. The Friday feeling that the brand spent 6 decades selling is becoming increasingly difficult to find. Outback Steakhouse built its entire identity around a fantasy of the Australian Outback that had very little to do with Australia and everything to do with what American families wanted from a casual dining steakhouse in the early 1990s. The bloomin' onion that became one of the most iconic appetizers in American restaurant history, the Alice Springs chicken, the steaks that came out on sizzling plates to tables full of families who were celebrating something or simply wanted a real dinner without cooking it themselves. Outback grew to more than 700 locations and became the anchor of its parent company Bloomin' Brands, which also operated Carrabba's Italian Grill and Bonefish Grill. But the turnaround strategy that Bloomin' Brands announced in 2026 carried a specific and significant cost. The company permanently closed 33 locations in a single day as part of a restructuring that ultimately targeted 41 total closures across the United States. The communities that lost their local Outback did not get advance warning in most cases. The closures happened quickly and completely. What Bloomin' Brands is attempting is a version of Outback that operates fewer locations more profitably. Whether that strategy works depends on whether the brand can hold its remaining customer base through a restructuring process that has already taken dozens of dining rooms off the map permanently. Denny's has been open 24 hours a day for so long that the concept of a Denny's being closed feels almost philosophically wrong. The diner that never turned off its lights. The Grand Slam breakfast that was available at 3 in the morning for anyone who needed it. The coffee that kept getting refilled without anyone having to ask. Denny's built its reputation on availability and consistency in a way that made it genuinely irreplaceable for a specific kind of American diner who needed a reliable meal at an unpredictable hour. At its peak, the chain operated more than 1,700 locations across the United States. But the 150 permanent closures that Denny's committed to completing by the end of 2025 and into 2026 represent a contraction that the brand has not fully reckoned with publicly. The locations being closed are described as underperforming, but underperformance in the Denny's model often means a community where the customer base that once filled the booths at midnight has shifted in ways the restaurant could not adapt to. Fewer late-night diners. Fewer truck stops anchoring the locations that made Denny's feel essential. Fewer reasons to drive to a sit-down diner when a drive-thru is faster and closer. The 24-hour promise that defined Denny's for decades has already been quietly abandoned at many remaining locations. The lights that were never supposed to go off are going off one by one. Winn-Dixie has been feeding families across the American South for nearly a century, the grocery chain that generations of Southern households built their weekly shopping routines around, the produce section that smelled like it was supposed to. The butcher counter where someone who knew what they were doing could answer a question about the cut you were looking at. Winn-Dixie at its peak operated hundreds of locations across Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, and Mississippi, and was as embedded in the fabric of Southern grocery shopping as sweet tea and front porch sitting. But the financial pressures that have been reshaping the American grocery industry for years hit Winn-Dixie in ways that its loyal customer base could not fully absorb. More than 90 locations closed across the South in 2025, as the company worked through a transition process that involved converting some stores and permanently closing others. The remaining locations are completing their final transitions in 2026, with closures wrapping up across multiple states. For the communities where Winn-Dixie was the primary grocery option, the closures leave a gap that is not easily filled by a competitor willing to move into the same real estate at the same price point for the same customers. A grocery store that has been in the same location for 40 years is not just a place to buy food. It is part of the infrastructure of daily life, and when it closes, that infrastructure has to be rebuilt from somewhere else. GameStop was the place you went when a new game came out and you needed to be there on launch day. The midnight release events that turned a Tuesday night into something that felt like an occasion worth staying up for. The used game section where you could find something you had missed at a fraction of the original price. The pre-order bonuses that gave you a reason to commit to a purchase weeks before the game was available. GameStop built its entire business around the physical experience of buying and selling video games, and for a long time that business was genuinely thriving, with more than 5,800 locations across the United States. But the shift to digital game downloads did not happen slowly. It happened fast, and it happened completely. When a customer can buy the same game from their couch in 30 seconds, the only thing that brings them to a GameStop is a habit strong enough to override that convenience. In 2026, GameStop is closing hundreds of additional locations as the company searches for a reason to exist in a retail landscape where the product it was built to sell is increasingly delivered without any physical store involved. The famous 2021 short squeeze that briefly made GameStop the most talked about stock in the country did not change the underlying business. It changed the stock price for a few weeks. The underlying business is still losing the argument with digital distribution, one closed location at a time. Big Lots built its reputation on the thrill of the unexpected find. The closeout merchandise that showed up on the shelves without announcement and disappeared just as quickly. The furniture section that somehow always had something worth considering at a price that made you feel like you had found something rather than simply bought something. For the customers who loved Big Lots, the appeal was genuine, and it kept them coming back in a way that more predictable retailers never quite managed to replicate. But the financial structure underneath that retail experience was never as stable as the loyal customer base made it appear. Big Lots filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September 2024 and was acquired by Variety Wholesalers in what looked at the time like a genuine rescue. 15 months later, Big Lots is closing stores again. The rescue that was supposed to give the brand a new foundation turned out to be temporary stability rather than real recovery. 2 bankruptcies in 15 months is not a streak of bad luck. It is the market telling a brand something that the brand has not yet fully accepted about whether its model can survive in the environment it is currently operating in. The closeout merchandise model that made Big Lots feel special to its customers is also the model that makes the business nearly impossible to run profitably when costs rise and consumer spending tightens at the same time. Family Dollar was supposed to be the answer for the communities that larger retailers had not reached and that other discount options had not fully served. The neighborhood store for the customer who needed everyday essentials at prices that worked on a budget without much room in it. At its peak, Family Dollar operated more than 8,000 locations across the United States, making it one of the most widely distributed retail brands in the country, particularly in rural and lower-income urban markets where affordable options were already limited. But the acquisition by Dollar Tree in 2015 for nearly $9 billion created problems that neither company ever fully resolved. The two brands operated on fundamentally different models, and the attempt to run them under one corporate structure created friction that showed up in the financial results year after year. In 2026, Dollar Tree is closing more than 370 Family Dollar locations and has been actively exploring a full sale of the brand to a separate buyer. When your own parent company is trying to sell you, it is a specific kind of signal about how much internal confidence exists in the brand's future. The communities feeling these closures most are the same communities that were already underserved before Family Dollar opened. The store that was the closest affordable option for household essentials is now closing, and for many of those neighborhoods, nothing equivalent is moving in to replace it. Saks Fifth Avenue was never just a store, it was a destination. The kind of place where the shopping bags alone felt like a statement, and where the window displays on Fifth Avenue stopped pedestrians on the sidewalk every single holiday season for as long as anyone could remember. Walking into a Saks felt like walking into a version of American luxury that had been carefully maintained and continuously earned over more than a century of operation. The perfume counters on the ground floor, the designer floors that stocked names most people had only seen in magazines. The particular atmosphere of a building that knew exactly what it was and had never needed to apologize for it. Saks Fifth Avenue was not just a retail brand. It was a cultural institution that represented the very top of what American department store shopping could be, at its most aspirational and its most complete. But in January 2026, Saks Global filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, and the institution that had seemed permanent revealed just how fragile the financial structure underneath it had become. The collapse came directly from a $2.7 billion acquisition of Neiman Marcus in 2024 that was supposed to create a luxury retail powerhouse capable of competing at the highest level of the American market. Instead, it created a combined entity so buried under debt obligations that it could not service them within 18 months of closing the deal. The company missed a $100 million interest payment on December 30th, 2025. Total debt at the time of the bankruptcy filing sat between $1 billion and $10 billion. The luxury image that Saks had spent more than a century building could not survive the weight of what one badly structured acquisition did to its balance sheet in less than 2 years. The vendors who supplied Saks with the designer merchandise that filled its floors had not been paid in months before the filing. Designers and luxury brands that had built long relationships with Saks found themselves listed as creditors in a bankruptcy proceeding rather than partners in a functioning retail relationship. The staff who had worked in those stores for years found themselves inside a company that was fighting for survival rather than curating the kind of shopping experience that had made Saks worth visiting in the first place. What is happening to Saks Global right now is not just the story of one retailer making one bad deal. It is the story of what happens when the debt used to build something exceeds the value of what was built. The most recognizable name in American luxury retail is closing locations and fighting for survival in 2026, in a way that would have seemed completely impossible to anyone standing in that Herald Square flagship just 5 years ago. 7-Eleven is so embedded in the American landscape that most people stopped seeing it years ago. It became part of the background in the way that only the most ubiquitous things do. The lit sign on the corner that was always there regardless of what else changed around it. The Slurpee that has been a cultural reference point for so long that it barely needs advertising to stay relevant. The Big Gulp, the hot dogs rotating slowly under warming lights at any hour of the day or night. The specific smell of a convenience store that every American recognizes instantly without being able to fully describe what it is made of. 7-Eleven grew to become the largest convenience store chain in the world, and for decades that scale felt like its own form of protection against the forces that were quietly reshaping every other retail category around it. A brand that is literally on every corner is a brand that is very difficult to imagine not being there. But in fiscal 2026, 7-Eleven announced plans to close 645 locations across the United States. That number did not arrive without warning. The company had already closed 592 locations in 2024 and 2025 combined, following a 26% drop in customer purchases since 2019. A 26% decline in purchases over 7 years is not a blip. It is a structural shift in how the customers who once made 7-Eleven part of their daily routine are now moving through their days without stopping. The convenience store model that 7-Eleven pioneered is now being competed against from every direction simultaneously, and with tools that did not exist when the chain built its dominance. Gas stations have expanded their food and beverage offerings until the distinction between a gas station stop and a convenience store run has almost disappeared. Fast food drive-thrus have become faster and more predictable for the customer who wants something specific quickly. Grocery delivery apps have eliminated the need to make a physical stop for many of the small immediate purchases that once made a 7-Eleven run feel like the obvious solution. More than 1,200 locations closing over a 2-year period while customer purchases fall by more than a quarter is not a real estate story. It is not about finding better corners or better markets. It is about a brand that defined a retail category, watching that category get absorbed by competitors who do not need a separate store to offer the same convenience. The corner that 7-Eleven has occupied for decades is still there. What is becoming less certain with every passing quarter is whether 7-Eleven will still be the thing standing on it. Looking at all 12 of these chains together, the most striking thing is not the bankruptcies or the closures individually. It is the speed. These are not brands that faded slowly over generations. These are names that were open last year, last month, and in some cases last week. Chains that had hundreds of locations and millions of loyal customers who never saw the end coming because the end did not announce itself. It arrived quietly through a bankruptcy filing, a lease that did not get renewed, a sign on the door that appeared one morning without warning. Some of these chains are already gone. Others are closing locations right now while you are watching this, and the ones still standing are standing on ground that is considerably less solid than the parking lots and the bright signs above the entrance make them appear. The America that had a Red Lobster on every highway exit and a GameStop in every mall and a Denny's that never turned its lights off is changing faster than most people have stopped to notice. Which one of these chains do you actually remember visiting? Drop it in the comments. Your answer might shape what we cover next.